When people hear medieval battle, they usually picture knights in shining armor, dramatic sword fights, and noble warriors charging into glory. But the reality? It was nothing like that. Medieval warfare was chaotic, brutal, and absolutely horrifying. There were no clean fights, no heroic moments, just blood, panic, exhaustion, and survival at any cost. In this video, we're breaking down what a medieval battle was really like. Not the movie version, but the historical truth. From how armies were gathered and organized, to what actually happened when the fighting began, and what came after the battlefield went quiet. If you think it was just swords and honor, think again. This is medieval combat as it really was. Raw, violent, and unforgiving. Number 1. Preparation and recruitment. The preparation phase of a medieval battle was far more complex than it might seem. It began weeks or even months before any actual combat. Lords and kings needed time to raise armies, which meant calling on their vassals to fulfill feudal obligations. In this system, nobles were required to provide a certain number of fighting men to their liege in exchange for the land they held. These men could include trained knights, household retainers, and peasant levies. Knights were heavily armored warriors who often came from the nobility, while the majority of the army was made up of infantry with far less training or equipment. Recruitment was rarely voluntary. Most commoners had no military experience and were summoned by force or duty. They might leave behind their farms, families, and tools for a cause they neither chose nor fully understood. Unlike professional soldiers, these peasants lacked proper training and discipline. As a result, their survival often depended more on numbers than skill. Equipping an army was another serious concern. Wealthier soldiers brought their own arms and armor, often passed down through generations. A knight's kit could include a sword, lance, shield, mail, or plate armor, and a helmet with a visor. In contrast, peasants made do with basic spears, wooden shields, or farming tools repurposed for war. Protective clothing might be nothing more than thick cloth or leather. Chainmail was expensive, and full-plate armor was reserved for the elite. Logistical planning involved gathering supplies like food, fodder for horses, tents, and medical provisions. Leaders had to consider how to transport all of this across long distances, especially when moving large numbers of men and animals. Locations for battle were often chosen for strategic advantage, control of roads, bridges, or high ground, but diplomacy sometimes delayed the fighting. Still, negotiations were fragile, and when talks collapsed, full-scale warfare was inevitable. Number 2. Command structure and strategy. The structure of command within a medieval army was strictly hierarchical, built on feudal relationships and rigid chains of authority. At the top stood the king, prince, or leading noble who held ultimate control over the army's actions. Below him were high-ranking commanders, often dukes, counts, or trusted knights, each responsible for specific divisions or contingents drawn from their own lands. Orders filtered downward through this chain, reaching captains and sergeants who managed smaller groups of infantry, archers, and cavalry. However, the lack of centralized communication technology made real-time command extremely difficult once battle commenced. In the absence of radios or any fast, reliable method of transmitting battlefield instructions, armies relied on rudimentary but essential signaling tools. Visual cues, such as flags or banners, indicated movement, retreat, or regrouping points. These symbols were unique to specific lords or units, allowing men to orient themselves in the chaos. Auditory signals, including horns, drums, and trumpets, were used to issue broad commands, though they were often drowned out by the roar of combat. For more precise orders, messengers on horseback carried instructions across the field, but this method was slow and often failed under pressure. Strategic planning before the battle had to account for the unpredictability of communication. Commanders placed significant emphasis on terrain, as it directly influenced their formations and movement. Elevation offered both visibility and defensive strength. Riverbanks and marshes served as natural obstacles. Forest could be used for cover or ambushes. The arrangement of troops was deliberate. Infantry typically held the center, forming dense lines or shield walls to resist frontal attacks. Cavalry, highly mobile and often heavily armored, were stationed on the flanks to maneuver and charge as needed. Archers and crossbowmen were positioned at the rear or high ground to harass the enemy from a distance. Overall strategy in medieval warfare focused less on total destruction and more on collapsing enemy morale and disrupting formations. A single breach in the line could lead to panic and rout, turning a well-ordered army into a scattered, vulnerable crowd. Commanders aimed to exploit weaknesses quickly, often committing reserves at critical moments to shift the balance of power. Number 3. The beginning of battle. The initial phase of a medieval battle was marked by a deliberate escalation of force, typically starting with long-range weaponry intended to weaken the opposing side before direct contact. Armies would position their missile troops, longbowmen, crossbowmen, and in some cases, slingers, at the front or along the flanks. These units played a critical role in shaping the opening stage of combat. Longbowmen, particularly effective at long distances, could unleash a high volume of arrows within a short span of time, creating a deadly curtain of projectiles. Their ability to maintain rapid fire rates made them especially valuable in disrupting formations and provoking early panic. Crossbowmen, although slower to reload, delivered bolts with immense force. The penetrating power of a crossbow made it a serious threat to armored troops, including knights in chainmail or early plate. Even partial hits could injure or destabilize heavily equipped fighters, undermining the cohesion of frontline units before physical engagement. Slingers, though less common in later periods, still appeared in some armies and were capable of inflicting injuries with surprising accuracy using lead or stone projectiles. After the ranged assault inflicted its toll, the transition to close combat began. Infantry units advanced steadily, sometimes under continuing arrow fire, forming dense ranks of men armed with spears, axes, and swords. Simultaneously, cavalry units positioned on the wings awaited signals to charge. Their role was to break the enemy's momentum, target exposed sides, or cause disorder among missile troops. A cavalry charge, if timed correctly, could create a gap in enemy lines, but it was a double-edged tactic. Against well-prepared formations, particularly those equipped with long pikes or entrenched positions, it could lead to devastating losses. The moment of collision between the two main forces was abrupt and violent. There was no extended exchange or formal challenge. It was a fast, brutal engagement where hesitation could be fatal. The intensity of that first clash often decided the direction of the battle. Troops had to rely on instinct, muscle memory, and the discipline of formation. Confusion set in almost immediately, but those first seconds were critical for gaining an advantage and forcing the enemy off balance. Number 4. Combat conditions. The conditions under which medieval combatants fought were harsh, disorienting, and unforgiving. Once the battle lines had closed and hand-to-hand fighting began, the battlefield became a chaotic and crowded environment where visibility, mobility, and coordination were severely compromised. Physical exhaustion set in rapidly. The weight of armor, especially for knights clad in full chainmail or plate, restricted movement, drained stamina, and intensified heat. Helmets, while essential for protection, limited both peripheral vision and hearing, making it difficult to detect threats from nearby or incoming blows from behind. The terrain added another layer of complexity. Battles were rarely fought on ideal ground. Fields might be uneven, muddy, or strewn with obstacles. Wet or loose soil turned quickly into a hazardous surface under the trampling of thousands of feet and hooves. Slipping or falling in such conditions was not only likely but dangerous. A fallen soldier risked being crushed by others, trampled by horses, or struck down before he could recover. Maintaining footing required constant physical effort, which wore down even the most well-conditioned fighters. In the heart of combat, personal duels were rare. There was little room for one-on-one encounters with clear rules. Instead, soldiers faced attacks from multiple directions in tight quarters. Blows from maces, axes, swords, and spears landed with brutal force. Many wounds were deep and fatal. Armor offered some protection, but joints and gaps remained vulnerable. Injuries to the legs, neck, and face were especially common. The pressure of battle left little time to react carefully, and many deaths came from unexpected or unseen angles. Communication during combat was almost non-existent. Shouting commands was futile over the noise of clashing weapons, screams, and war cries. Disorientation was common, and soldiers could become separated from their units, increasing their risk of being overwhelmed. Medical assistance, if it existed at all, was extremely limited. Battlefield treatment consisted of rudimentary efforts to stop bleeding or amputate damaged limbs. Infection, untreated wounds, and internal injuries led to high post-battle mortality. Simply surviving the immediate fight did not guarantee survival in the following days. Number 5, psychological and physical impact. The immediate and lasting effects of medieval combat extended far beyond the battlefield. The psychological burden carried by those who fought was immense and deeply rooted in the brutal nature of the experience. Soldiers faced overwhelming emotional stress from the moment they entered the field. Fear of death was constant, heightened by the unpredictability of combat and the visible suffering of others. The environment itself contributed to mental strain. Seeing comrades dismembered, hearing the cries of the wounded, and smelling blood, sweat, and decay produced a deeply disturbing atmosphere that left lasting psychological scars. Unlike modern understandings of trauma, medieval societies lacked the language or medical framework to recognize mental health conditions. However, symptoms that align closely with what is now known as post-traumatic stress disorder, such as nightmares, emotional detachment, and long-term anxiety, were likely common. Veterans of multiple battles often displayed withdrawn or erratic behavior, which was attributed to spiritual causes or dismissed entirely. Emotional numbness was a coping mechanism for many, particularly those who had witnessed repeated loss or survived near-death encounters. Physically, the toll on the human body was equally severe. Even those who avoided direct injury endured constant strain from wearing heavy armor, handling weapons, and moving across difficult terrain. Combat often lasted for hours under intense pressure, with little rest, leading to muscle fatigue, dehydration, and heat exhaustion. For the wounded, survival was uncertain. Amputations and wound treatment were performed without anesthesia or antiseptics. Pain was endured in full awareness, and recovery, if it came, was slow and incomplete. Infection was a persistent threat. Even minor wounds could become fatal due to poor hygiene and the lack of effective medical knowledge. Many who survived the initial battle later succumbed to fever, sepsis, or gangrene. Others were left permanently disabled with lost limbs, impaired mobility, or chronic pain. The experience of battle did not end when fighting stopped. It shaped the lives and bodies of those involved for months, years, or the rest of their lives. Number 6. Sieges and urban battles. Not all medieval warfare occurred on open terrain. A significant portion of armed conflict took place around fortified cities, castles, and walled settlements. These engagements, known as sieges, were often prolonged, resource-intensive, and marked by extreme hardship for both attackers and defenders. Unlike the relatively brief and decisive nature of open-field battles, sieges could stretch for weeks or even several months, depending on the strength of the fortifications, the availability of supplies, and the determination of those involved. The attacker's primary goal was to breach or bypass the defensive walls, and they relied heavily on specialized siege equipment. Trebuchets were used to launch heavy stones or incendiary materials over walls to damage structures and create chaos. Battering rams were deployed to break through gates or weak sections of the fortifications. Scaling ladders and siege towers allowed troops to climb over the defenses, though this was highly dangerous and often resulted in heavy casualties. Sappers sometimes attempted to undermine walls by digging tunnels and collapsing them from below. Defenders, in turn, employed every available method to repel assaults. Arrows and crossbow bolts rained down from ramparts. Boiling liquids, heavy stones, and burning materials were dropped on attackers attempting to climb or force entry. Defensive architecture, such as murder holes, crenellations, and gatehouses, was specifically designed to enhance the effectiveness of resistance and protect those inside. Conditions within besieged locations deteriorated quickly. Food and clean water ran low, disease spread rapidly due to overcrowding and poor sanitation, and morale weakened as the siege dragged on. Civilians often suffered the most, trapped between the attackers outside and the demands of the garrison inside. Starvation, illness, and violence became part of daily life. When a city or fortress finally fell, the aftermath was frequently catastrophic. Victorious forces, especially if they had suffered heavy losses or long hardship, looted possessions, burned homes, and killed both combatants and non-combatants. Massacres were not uncommon, and women and children were particularly vulnerable. Sieges were among the most destructive and brutal aspects of medieval warfare, often leaving settlements in ruins and populations devastated. Number 7. Aftermath and consequences. The conclusion of a medieval battle did not mark the return to order, but rather the beginning of a different kind of devastation. In the immediate aftermath, the battlefield was a landscape of destruction. Hundreds or even thousands of bodies lay strewn across the terrain, some lifeless, others gravely wounded and moaning for help that often never came. Soldiers who survived the clash rarely had the time or resources to care for the injured. Battlefield medicine was almost non-existent, and those with serious wounds faced slow, painful deaths from blood loss, infection, or exposure. There was little distinction between friend and enemy in this stage. Any wounded fighter left behind risked being stripped, abandoned, or killed outright. Looting was not only tolerated but expected. Soldiers, regardless of allegiance, scavenged the dead for anything of value. Intact armor, quality weapons, money, and even clothing. This practice extended beyond the fallen enemies. Comrades and allies were also robbed, especially if their gear was of superior quality. The motivation was simple. War was expensive, and personal survival often depended on whatever one could carry away. Even battlefield equipment like horses, tents, and carts were claimed by whoever could secure them first. Burial practices varied depending on the scale of the battle and the proximity of local populations. In some cases, the dead were gathered and buried in mass graves, usually shallow and quickly dug. But when resources or manpower were insufficient, corpses were left to rot in place. The smell of decay, combined with swarms of flies and scavenging animals, made the area dangerous and almost uninhabitable. In warmer climates or during summer months, disease spread rapidly from decomposing bodies, further threatening both armies and nearby civilians. The civilian population endured significant losses as well. Farmlands were often trampled or deliberately destroyed, livestock taken for food, and entire villages burned. Homes were looted or repurposed for military use. Those who lived near battle sites faced economic ruin, loss of family members, and the constant fear of renewed violence. In many cases, peasants were forced to provide labor for cleanup efforts or face punishment from victorious forces. For survivors of battle, whether soldier or civilian, the trauma did not end with the fighting. Physical injuries were often permanent, and psychological damage lingered for years. Communities had to be rebuilt, relationships restored, and lost generations mourned. Entire regions could be destabilized by a single campaign, and the scars of war remained visible not just in the land, but in the minds of those who lived through it. The end of battle was rarely a return to peace. It was the beginning of reckoning with everything that had been destroyed.